Do you want ideas for using your 12 by 12 pattern paper without making scraps? Hi, I'm Jess from jesscrafts.com, and I'm here to help you make the most of your crafty supplies and time. So let's get making. Today I have 12 by 12 paper busting template for A2 cards number 27, which means there are 26 other ideas for turning your A2 cards into, for turning your 12 by 12 paper into A2 size cards without pattern paper scraps. You can get them all at jesscrafts.com, and the very first link in the video description will be for this particular template, which you can print out and follow along. Today we're going to make 6 cards, 6 A2 cards with the one sheet of paper. I am planning on moving away from 12 by 12 soon, but most of my Easter paper was 12 by 12, and I wanted to squeeze in a few more Easter cards before that season is over. For today's card, I wanted to use an image from an Avery Elle stamp set, and I decided that I should pick a paper that would coordinate well with it, but would give me a side that isn't too busy so that I could place it on. And so I picked out a few papers from the Easter Time collection by Opaque Paper. This is actually the same paper I will be using in the upcoming Cardmaker Success Summit, so the same line of paper, not the same exact sheet. So just as a heads up there, if you haven't heard about the Cardmaker Success Summit, it's a free weekend event where you can watch 45, I think a little more than 45 instructors giving free tutorials and classes, and there's, you know, bonus opportunity and all that. But I'll leave a link for that in the video description too. I'm going to be doing a 12 by 12 tutorial there. So I thought, you know, it would be a nice opportunity to use this paper with all of the Easter eggs, for instance. However, he gets kind of lost on that paper. Luckily, in this collection from Opaque, the other side is a lot less busy. So I think that's going to work. 12 by 12 double-sided paper is the most forgiving with this kind of thing. But if you, like, say you had a paper like this that was really busy, you could pair, and it was single-sided, you could pair it with another pattern paper that is single-sided and is a little less busy. But we're just going to be using one sheet because ours is double-sided today. So the first thing I'll always do is cut off the branding strip, if there is one, so that I am then working with a 12 by 12 piece and not that little bit of extra. And then I'm going to follow the sketch. And the sketch tells me that I'm going to need some strips of paper that are 1.5 inches wide, and then it'll be 12 inches long, and we'll cut it up. So we'll start with 1.5 inches. I'm going to measure from this side. So I say, you know, 12 minus 1.5 is 10.5. And I can make my first cut. And then I'll subtract 1.5 again, get to 9, next cut. These two strips will then get cut into 4-inch strips. So I can do 8, and then 4, similarly 8, 4. Okay. Next, this piece that is 9 by 12, I see that at the bottom I need to cut a 1/2 inch strip off. So that's the very first thing I want to do, because that is a small measurement and would be tricky to cut if I only had 1 inch left. Cutting 1/2 inch off would be a little bit more frustrating. So now I'm turning it to the 12-inch side again, and I'm going to come to 1/2 inch, which would be 11.5, and then bring it to 11. And now I have my 2 1/2-inch strips. You'll see these would be pretty good for sentiments. And they'll come up in the card sketch shortly. And next, I have pieces of paper that are 1.5 by 5.5. So I take my 11-inch piece, and I'm going to cut it to 5.5. Then I will cut all of this into the 1.5-inch strips that I will need across the card. And this is the side, or this is the section of the paper that I'm probably going to use the egg side on. So you can, if you want, try to match these up. I'm gonna I might need to really concentrate to make sure that I actually cut them at 1.5. But basically what I mean is you could keep these two pieces together because they're going to be split across a card, and that way they, you know, it looks like they match up. you don't have to do that, but it might be something you want to do, and I wanted to call that out sooner so that if it is something you want to do, you're not trying to have to match them all up later on. So again, I could take the next two, know that they match up, and put them off to the side together, put them in a bag, anything that like works well for you to keep things together. Sometimes those trays from scrapbook.com can be nice for this kind of thing. Like, you know, okay, I know these two go together, and then I have a tray for each one of the cards I'm making. I mean, 6 trays might sound like a lot, but there are so many ways to use those. I am never like, oh, I have too many trays. Okay, and then we'll do the same thing where we're just going to cut all of these to those 1.5 inch strips, and we'll be ready to start assembling our card. We are going to need a couple of cardstock mats. Oh, sorry. Also, this strip that was 1/2 inch needs to be cut into 3-inch bits. So it was 9. So then I went to 6 and then 3. And we're going to get a piece of coordinating cardstock to do our couple of mats. I picked out a purple because I'd already picked out the colors that I wanted to use for the egg, kind of inspired by the colors I saw in the collection. And I colored this with Copic marker. I'll probably color one in the video to kind of give you an idea of the decisions I made, but I'm going to need to cut my cardstock mats, and the mats need to be 1 3/4 by 4 1/4. And so this new piece of cardstock, of course you can always start with your scraps. I'm not sure I have any. I have a few, so maybe I can make use of some of those, but they're rather tiny, so it's not going to work for this part. I do like to go to my scraps first if I can. I have this piece. This might work well for, yeah, it's not quite long enough for this. We'll talk about that in a minute. Anyway, so because I need a 4 1/4 inch mat, I'm going to start with this 8 1/2, because when I cut that in half, it will give me my mat perfectly without any scraps. So it's 11 inches long. I'm going to take 1 3/4 inch off. Then I can cut that in half to 4 1/4, and that will be the mat that I need. I need 6 of those because I am going to make 6 cards. So 1 3/4 and then a full inch. And we'll do another one. Okay. And then I should have those larger mats, and then I can go to that same piece of paper to get my other smaller mats, which are for these little tiny strips. So they need to be 3 1/4. I was like, is this paper oh, so it happens to be 3 1/4. That's why I like to go to my scraps. And then I need to cut 0.75 inches off of it 3 times. So we'll see if I can get that out of it. So 3/4 of an inch. And we'll do that again. 3/4 of an inch. Let's make sure this is making sense. I can't get all 6 out of this scrap, but I'm going to get a few, and that's going to make me feel like, okay, I'm fine to either toss this scrap now, or I can instead use the scrap for like some fake foam tape, and I'll show you what I mean by that. So like I have this little bit left, and I could just toss that. I don't feel too bad about not using it. Or I could take my adhesive and I can put 2 layers of cardstock together by folding it in half, and then I can use this to prop up my little bunny later instead of getting out some foam tape. You can even make it like 3 layers thick if you like it a little thicker or something like that, but I like to have just a small amount of dimension, and so that can be helpful. One of the reasons I chose this paper, this cardstock, was because I recently used it, so I was pretty sure it coordinated well with the collection, and I know that it coordinates with the grape jelly ink from Lawn Fawn, so I wouldn't have to like look up a color or something for it. So then I can stamp my sentiment. Now, because this is a no scrap method, the dilemma becomes if I were to stamp on this and it doesn't look good, or I stamp imperfectly, that can be kind of problematic because I don't really have another piece to use. So what I sometimes would do is I'm like, well, this piece, I'm going to use the egg side when I make my final card. As you can see, we're going to have 2 pieces, and I forgot to keep pairing these together. We're gonna have two pieces like this, and then this strip and this strip, but it'll have a cardstock mat around it, and we're gonna put that on this side too. So I know I want these to be the egg side. So I can test on the back of one of these strips. Or sometimes if you have a branding strip, you can also test on the little scrap that might show you something. Might show you the other side of the paper. Okay, so that is not super readable. Like, you can certainly see it, and I could have stamped, like I could have held the stamp on there a little bit longer. So you might not want to do colored ink in that instance. And this is what I've been able to, like, you know, that's why I like to test it out. I do notice that there is a brown chocolate bunny, and so I can probably incorporate brown ink for my sentiment. I don't really want to go with black because there's not really any black in this particular collection. Like, it's a very soft pastel-y kind of card. And so I'm going to test out a brown ink. Again, just kind of stamping it on that little bit of, you know, it was going to get thrown out anyway. I think that's more readable. And I like the idea of doing the brown because it's a little less harsh. So then I can stamp all of these with my brown ink, and you want to, you know, take a pause and see if there's a side that like looks better as the facing up side. You know, do you want these swoops to be swooping down or swooping up? Because you're going to want your other piece of paper to match. The way that they printed it is that these sort of swoop down like this, so you can choose to mimic that or not. But, you know, apply that to whatever specific pattern paper you're using. In terms of coloring the bunny for this project and the bunny on the sitting on the egg, I wanted to share just like what I think my most helpful tips would be. And that is, in this case, the most important thing is that I make this egg look round and dimensional. And the way I'm going to do that is by making sure I put a shadow at the top and bottom of the egg. So I did that with each of the other stripes of the egg, but I'm just going to demonstrate on one stripe here. Now, I personally always find it easier to flick away from me, and I find that a flicking motion allows me to get a better blend, but different people kind of have preference. Like, some people like to flick towards them, they find that more comfortable. So that's something that you have to learn as a personal preference. So I would start with my darkest color, move into my medium color, and continuing with that flicking motion, I'm starting in the area that I made my darkest color and coming out and then flicking away from me. And then I will go to my lightest color and do the same thing. You may find it helpful to do one side at a time because in my experience, Copic markers tend to do best if you haven't let them dry as long in between. So if you can't put on a layer, come back in 10 minutes, put on another layer and get the same blending you would if you went from one marker to the other more immediately. And paper choice matters a little bit with alcohol markers. So I use Neenah Solar White 80-pound thicker cardstock that absorbs the ink, makes it so that I don't get as much of a blend because before the two colors can blend together, the ink sinks into the paper. So that's also why that smooth cardstock is helpful. Now, the other tip I want to share in terms of something that I think would be useful is I am fussy cutting these. And when you fussy cut, you sometimes don't get perfect edges. You can kind of see it here on the bunny's ear. There's a little bit of white paper showing through. It's probably a little more noticeable because I'm doing it on black. And what I would do in that instance is I take a black brush tip marker. It can be any, here I want to show you what I mean by brush tip. I have a Pitt Artist pen, but it can really be any brush tip marker, and I just run it along the sides of my bunny so that anywhere where I cut, I now drawn back in the black line instead of seeing the white core of the paper, you're going to see that more solid black line. And it's a pretty minimal effect, but it's just, you know, if you feel like a little bit frustrated, you feel like, oh, fussy cutting seems a little less, you know, finished, or I don't want to say professional looking, because it's still like we're not professionals. We're not trying to look like we mass produced our cards, but I guess finished is more the word I want to say. Then I think that that helps quite a bit. So as we're ready to finish off the cards, we put the 2 strips of the eggs. Those were the 1.5 by 5.5 inch strips, and I made sure that mine coordinated, but that might not be very important depending on which pattern paper you're using. And then I placed my other side of paper, this 1.5 by 4 inch piece of pattern paper here, and as you can see, the cardstock mat behind it kind of gives it that extra width that lets it stretch across both, and you're going to kind of center it from the top and bottom and the left and right. I just eyeball that because it doesn't particularly matter if it is centered, but and then I'm going to add my sentiment. This is another place where a cardstock scrap could come in handy, because as I lay this across here, you can see that it's supported here in the middle on the cardstock layer and the pattern paper layer. And if those are both pretty thin, this isn't really an issue. But if you have some thicker cardstock, it might look better if you put a little bit of extra cardstock behind each of these sides so it lays more flat, or you can just tape it right on. It's not a big deal, but something to kind of another way to use up those tiny cardstock scraps you're not sure what to do with if you like that look. And then you might notice I stamped my sentiment off to the left. That's because my little bunny, he is looking down towards the left, and I thought if I make sure that he is not, like, I didn't want to stick him like smack dab in the center of the card like this. You can absolutely do that. You can put your sentiment there in the center of the card, but because my sentiment is not as long as my piece of pattern paper anyway, and in fact it's actually quite small compared to it, you know, if I shifted this over to the center, I think that it looks a little less interesting if everything is just like center, 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 you know, because that's kind of already the design. So I thought I'd break up everything being centered by putting the sentiment off to the left and the image off to the right. And the reason that the image is on the right is because if you kind of follow the bunny's eyes, not that they're open, but he's kind of looking down at the sentiment. And so they sort of flow into each other. Whereas if I put it behind him, I don't think it looks quite as good. I think it's totally fine, but I think this just looks a little bit more balanced and natural, and it breaks up some of the really center focus symmetry of the card. And then again, you can take that little bit of cardstock scrap that you may have produced or go into your pile of cardstock scraps and get a little something to boost your bunny up off the card, if that is the kind of look that you like. Of course, just also you could use your foam tape, but I like to share little tips here and there of, you know, how you can get the most out of your supplies, how you can use up some of those scraps. And we'll keep going till we have all 6 cards. If you found this video helpful, here's another video where you can find more ideas for enjoying your crafty time and supplies. Let me know you like this video with a share to your crafty community. Subscribe and click the bell so you don't miss the next template or tutorial, and check the video description for product links. See you in the next video.